Hi everyone and welcome back. This is video number 3 in my series on planning washes and managing edges. I'm ready to start the painting now, and in this video I'm going to show you how I place the lightest values in the painting using a wet on wet technique. And I'm just going to be focusing on the sky and the river, and I'll show you how I do that and how that then sets things up for further washes as the painting progresses. I just wanted to say quickly before I start the painting, because I know that some of you like this information, but it's not too important from my perspective. But just to say that the paper that I'm using is a piece of Arches, £140. It's got a rough texture to it. I like that, and I tend to use a rough paper in most of my landscape paintings. The paper has been stretched on a board, and that's important too, because as I'm going to be working wet on wet, and as the painting progresses, I'm going to be glazing over certain areas too, I want to make sure that the paper isn't buckling on me when it gets wet, as often happens when we paint in watercolour. The piece of paper is a half sheet, so that means sort of 52 centimetres by 34 centimetres once it's taped up, and then I've just put some masking tape down the sides, which just sort of crops the picture to the size that I want it. If you're working on a smaller scale, then of course you could use a watercolour block that's gummed on all 4 sides. But even though the manufacturer will tell you that this prevents the paper from buckling when it gets wet, it doesn't. If you're working with nice wet washes, you will find that the paper will buckle. So this is why I like to stretch it, to make sure that I don't have that and that I'm working on a nice flat surface throughout the painting. The painting's all drawn out. I've spoken in my previous video about my plans and how I'm going to approach this. So let's just start painting. Okay, so here's the scene. It's all drawn out, and you can see that as I've done this, what I've started to do already is make suggestions or little prompts to myself with regard to the edges in this painting. You can see there's a lot of drawing, a lot of information around here, but very little over this side, none whatsoever with regard to the big tree or the trees behind it, and that's because I'm going to allow my painting and what happens on the paper to a degree to determine what's going to happen with those edges. That will all become clear as we progress, but for now I've got to paint the sky and the river, and I'm not going to do those all in one. I'm going to do the sky first, and I'm going to wait for that to dry. I'm going to do the river second, and the reason for that is it allows me to concentrate and focus on getting a specific area right. We mentioned this in the last video. We don't need to go at this at 100 miles an hour. We can take our time and plot and plan our way round. So what I'm going to do is wet this area of sky with clear water on this nice soft Harque brush, which is perfect for the job. And I'm coming down over the top of the landscape in the background. And the reason for that, as we've said before, is quite simple. The landscape is much darker, and so we don't need to match up 2 similar toned edges. We can paint the dark tone over the top of the sky once it has dried. Okay, so the sky area is nice and wet. All I really need to worry about here in terms of edges is what's going to happen with the house, because the landscape's darker, that's no problem, but I want this still to be paler than the sky behind it. So I'm going to need to keep an eye on that, and I'll show you how I'll manage that as a small, insignificant background element. It's not a major part of the painting, it needs to be in there, but there's ways of dealing with that, and I'll show you how I'm going to do that. So let's get these washes in. They're relatively straightforward. I'm using a mix here of Naples yellow and permanent rose with a little bit of cobalt mixed in, and it creates a lovely soft feeling to what is an evening sky. And all I'm doing really is just putting in these warmer tones where the areas of cloud are, something like that. A few more lower down, and I will put some just on top of the house there, just to remind me that I need to come back to this. Now with a different brush, I'm just going to put in a mix of the same colours, but this is predominantly cobalt blue with a little bit of permanent rose, a tiny bit of Naples yellow in there too. And I'm just putting this on and allowing these colours to run together. I'm leaving gaps. I'm allowing this to streak a little because that's how the sky looks at the moment. I'm just going to warm it up with a little bit more permanent rose, but I don't want it to be too pink, so a little bit more Naples yellow goes in there too. And then just drop a shadow underneath some of these cloud areas. Now, one thing that I noticed, which is interesting, as I come down towards the horizon, is that the sky becomes cooler in temperature. So I'm just going to mix in a little bit of manganese blue here. It's a cooler blue. You can use cerulean or something like that if you don't have manganese, but I just find it mixes nicer, so I quite like it as a colour. And I'm just going to blend that in to the bottom of the sky here, making sure that I miss my house. That's important. And then I'm going to start fine-tuning the areas of sky up here. A little bit more tone in there. A little bit more warmth coming through here. It's quite nice and bright through there, so let's put some more into that area. Just needs to be a little bit warmer. That's it. It's just a little darker down by the horizon here too, and I just want to put this in to make it contrast with the white of the house. Okay, I'm now getting to the point where I'm happy with the sky as it is, so I'm just going to get this damp brush and use it to blend some of these areas together. It's a nice technique that helps me to manage the transitions in some parts of the sky. One thing that's important to do, particularly if you're using masking tape, is just to run a bit of kitchen paper along the edge there, just in case the paint's sitting on the top, or the water I should say, because it can have a tendency to run back onto your painting just as it all starts to dry up, and then you get runbacks, which is not so good. Okay, so I'm quite happy with how the sky has turned out. You can see, actually, even though I've stretched the paper, there's still a small element of buckling going on here, but it's okay, I can manage that. But that's what happens when I paint. I paint so wet. I love to get this area of the paper as wet as I can and allow these colours to run in smoothly, which they do. When it is that wet, all the colours mix and merge on the surface of the paper. That's important to me because when they dry, it gives a crisp, transparent look to the painting. If I just waited for that to go damp and then started painting, then the colours mix in the paper as opposed to on it, and you get a duller finish overall. So I'm happy with that, but let's just have a look now at the house, because you can see that even though I'd kept it fairly clear, you can still see that this blue has started to merge in a little bit. That's okay. What I'm going to do is just take my brush, and it's damp. And I'm just going to lift out that area there. So it's soft edged, but I've still got a nice white elevation to the front of the house there, and that's fine. Of course, I'm going to be putting trees around it, and there's the roof and what have you, so it will start to stand out. But I'm okay with a little bit of the blue merging into this, because this is in the distance. I don't want it to be as obvious and bright as the lights that I'm going to place in the foreground of the painting. And that's all good. I'm going to let it dry completely and then move on to the river. And of course, as I showed you when I did my series on skies, I can let this dry and then re-wet it and fine-tune areas of the sky if I need to. But I don't think I'm going to need to. I'm quite happy with that. So let's let it dry and then we will move on to the river. Okay, now I just want to show you a technique while I'm waiting for the sky to dry and before I paint the river, which I will use to preserve the whites on these boats. Now, I'm going to use two different techniques just so you can see the range of options that's open to you. On this boat here, I'm going to use a little bit of masking fluid just to preserve this area of white on the boat cabin, which is sunlit, while I put in this pale wash for the river. I wouldn't normally do this, and in fact I could do the same here on this boat, but again I'm not going to do that. I'm going to show you that here I will just paint around that. The reason I'm doing it is just to show you. It's just to show you that if this is something that you find easier to work with, then this is how to do it. I've got a little bit of masking fluid that I've poured out into this little beaker here, and I've also got a solution of washing up liquid from the kitchen and warm water, and I get that into my brush hairs because this masking fluid, not only does it stink, but it's just horrible to use. It clogs up your brush bristles, or hairs I should say, and this is why you don't use very expensive brushes for this. But just a little bit of this solution just gives them a bit more protection. Then get some masking fluid on the brush and put it on the area that you want to preserve. It's a sort of strange pinky yellow colour. It dries a bit more yellow and then you can see where it is. But I'm just going to cover carefully the edge of this cabin. And this is one of the issues that I have with masking fluid. Because I paint quite precisely, I like to have my edges as I want them to be. And it's not always easy to see exactly where you've put your masking fluid until you've painted the wash around it and you peel it off and you think, I didn't put that on that as carefully as I could have done, and it all just looks a little bit odd. So I usually prefer cutting around it myself with the paint as opposed to using masking fluid, and I'll show you that over here. That's probably all I need really. I'm not going to put any over this boat here in the background because the white here is in shade. It's almost the same tone. It's almost the same hue even as the river coming down. So I'm just going to protect that corner there. With masking fluid, you must wait for this to dry before you put a wash on. It doesn't take long, but if you paint over this while it's wet, then you might as well start again. Now I thought what I'd do while I wait for the masking fluid to dry, and of course the sky will take quite a while before that dries, and I don't want to get any runbacks from the river that I paint in going into that wet area. So what I'm going to do is show you an unusual technique that I use a lot in my paintings to help suggest texture. If you look closely at the river, you can see that there's some broken areas on the surface, particularly as we come round the bend towards the boat here. And a nice way to suggest those is to use a broken brush stroke that doesn't have any strongly defined edges, and then glaze over the top of it once it's dried. Now the reason I like doing that is twofold. Firstly, the paper is at its most resistant to paint when there are no washes on here. And that's important to achieve a good, delicate broken brush stroke. It's just so much easier than doing it on paper that has already received one or sometimes two separate washes. And the second reason is that once I put the River wash over the top, it will soften ever so slightly the edges of those marks. It may not be apparent on camera, but it's there, and I find it helps to not only make the brushstroke easier, but also to make the effect more subtle. And I'm just going to use this blue-grey mix that I've got on the palette here, and it's very pale. It doesn't need to be strong at all. Let's get some of this yellow used up while it's there. And I can see just on the side of the boat here, there's an area of broken water there. What I like to do is also to have a damp brush here to blend some of the edges of these marks away so it doesn't all look too obvious and mechanical. And then I'm just going to run some through here too. Back in with my damp brush, just softening some of these areas so that they will disappear once I paint over the top of them. And as I'm looking at this, I'm assessing the extent to which I've got some areas here where there's clearly a broken brush stroke and there's some edges there that have got a little bit of crispness to them, and then some of them also have disappeared, and then as I glaze over there'll be very little trace of those at all, and it just gives a nice combination of edges that helps to build up this sense of texture. And probably just one more through here. There we are, keep blending it in places. There's no right or wrong instructions on how to do this really, other than what I've just done. It's all down to your own experience, your practice making these type of shapes, and observing what they look like once you glaze over the top of them. So they're there now. I just need those to dry. I need masking fluid to dry. I need the sky to dry. Then we're good to go. We can put the wash in for the river over the top. And I think you will then see how nice these little textured areas look and give the sense of just a little bit of broken surface to the river. If I remember rightly, I think there was a very, very slight breeze while I was there, but it was generally quite still. But, you know, this is a tidal river. It's always on the move, and so having some sort of undulations on the surface or a suggestion of them is important. Okay, so now everything is dry, I can wet this area here where I'm going to put in the river. The reason I'm doing this is to try and avoid painting a river that has a hard edge and then having a bank on top of it that's got another hard edge and matching those two together. And likewise with the area of boats and jetties and things here. We want to try to avoid that. So if we put this very light tone in first, and I'm just going to cut around the boat here with some water and a very pale tone painted wet in wet, then we should avoid having that problem. You'll see what I mean as this starts to come together. Now I'm looking out for potential issues here. I've got a white area on this little support on top of the boat that I'll want to keep white, but I'll do that probably just by lifting it out before it dries. Like I said, I wanted this to be white here on the back of the boat, so I've just painted around that with the water, and that will stop my wash from running into it. Now I've mixed up here two different colours cobalt blue with a little bit of raw sienna in it, and I'm just going to put that over the top very carefully of this area of dry brushing that I put on earlier. And I'm going to allow this to run up into the bank, but you can see it's going to be a soft-edged area. I'm not too worried about the cabin because, as you can recall, I put masking fluid over that, but I don't want to go too far into this area of the boat here that I left either. Just to show you a different way of doing it. I'm varying this up with some slightly warmer blue as well, just to give it some visual interest. Carefully around the boat. And then into this area here, which is going to be painted over with reflections in due course. I need a little bit of blue in there, and a little bit of blue in there. I can let that run out. You can see it's starting to feather up there, so I'll just run my brush through there and manage that. But I've got a soft edge now everywhere along the river's boundary. I'm just going to mix up a little bit of raw sienna and permanent rose here and drop this into the side of the river by the far bank, just where you can see there's some light that's going to be reflected down into the river, and the same here as well. It's very subtle, but let's just get that in now. Oh, I've missed a little bit. There's going to need to be some blue through here, where there's a gap in that area by the jetty. I'm just keeping an eye on this support here, just to make sure the blue doesn't run into there. I'm happy with the hull on the boat here. You can see it's quite dirty actually from the photograph, so it's okay that there's a little bit of blue running along the bottom there. This edge has been preserved, so that's still nice and white. That's good. What I will do as this is drying is to make a darker tone of the same colour that I've been working with. And I'm just going to add a little bit of modelling to the surface of the river as it comes down into the foreground here. Again, not too much, it's very subtle. And I can do this because everything is still very wet. I'm working wet on wet here. I'm keeping my brush strokes horizontal. That's very important to help reinforce the idea or the illusion of water. And a little bit of a darker tone here, just so it registers strongly when we take off the masking fluid on the side of the boat there. Okay, I'm happy with that. It's all going to dry up paler than it is at the moment. That's always the case with watercolour, and particularly working wet on wet, it has the effect when I paint into the clear water of diluting my mixes even further, so you have to allow for that. But I want this to be very pale as the sky has dried too, because these are the brightest elements in my painting, and I'm working from light to dark. And if you go too dark with these areas, then everything has to be correspondingly darker, and you start to lose that freshness and that delicacy which looks so good with the watercolour medium. So that's all I'm going to concern myself with for this video. I've established the sky and the river, the two brightest elements in my painting. I've preserved the whites in the boats where I need those, and at this stage, other than the edge that has been preserved by the masking fluid and by cutting around the hull of this boat, everything's soft. Everything has merged into each other. It's run together nicely. And this is going to be so important as the painting progresses, because we've got a lot of crispness, a lot of edges, a lot of light and dark contrasts that are vivid. And to have those contrasting with these lovely, soft, smooth passages in a painting is what makes a watercolour look really fantastic. Well, it's been great to get started on the painting, and thanks very much for watching. Hopefully what you've been able to see is that you don't need to go at the painting at 100 miles an hour. You don't have to get a first wash done all in one go. Sometimes that works. Sometimes that's very useful, particularly if you're working outdoors and time's limited and the weather's changing, the light's starting to do different things. That can be very, very helpful. But when you're in the studio and you're making a painting of a complex scene, don't be afraid to relax and step back and break it down into sections that help you to manage what you're doing with perhaps a little less panic and a little more consideration. So plan your washes. Wash number 1, the sky. Let's just focus on that. Let's do that area. Wet it, paint it, let it dry. Then we move on to the river. We will tackle that. Again, wet the paper and allow those pale tones to run out into the riverbank, into some of the boats, into the jetties on the side of the river. That's perfectly okay, because we're going to be coming back over the top of it with darker tones, so we won't be matching up two separate edges. What we have put down is soft and it's blurred, and it enables us to paint with more freedom as the painting progresses. We preserved some edges with the masking fluid and cutting around the hull of the boat, and managing those edges becomes a little more straightforward because we've planned our washes. In the next video, what I'm going to do is start tackling some of the areas in the background, some of the areas on the riverbank, again building up the brightest and the palest tones, so that we're then in a position to start defining those with the application of some darker tones. I hope you'll be able to join me for that. And if you've enjoyed this video, perhaps you could just give it a thumbs up. That always helps. If you subscribe to the channel, thanks ever so much. But if not, please click on the subscribe button and the little bell icon, which will give you a notification by email each time I launch a new video. Now, what you may notice is that there is a new playlist, and I'm putting all these videos in there. I'd like to say it was my own fantastic idea, but of course it wasn't. My son Tom said, "Dad, look, just chuck them all in one playlist. It'll just make it so much easier for everybody to find them and follow them." So there they are. Thanks, Tom. That should make things a lot easier for you as these videos come online. Anyway, that's all for now. Thanks ever so much for watching. Thanks, as always, for your support. I look forward to seeing you next time.